So today, the United States Supreme Court delivered a 9-0 unanimous ruling that is already reshaping the legal landscape across the entire country. This decision took effect immediately, and it affects how law enforcement, courts, and everyday Americans understand their constitutional rights going forward. Whether you own a home, rent an apartment, or simply care about the limits of government power, this ruling matters to you. And the implications go far beyond the single case that brought this issue before the court. Make no mistake, this is not a narrow procedural ruling. This is a decision that clarifies a major constitutional standard, one that will now be applied in all 50 states, in both state and federal courts. And because the ruling was unanimous, it carries exceptional legal weight. There is no dissenting opinion to soften it, no internal disagreement to limit its reach. This is the Supreme Court speaking with one voice. Today, we're going to break down exactly what the court decided, why it matters, how it changes the legal rules on the ground, and what it means for your rights moving forward. Because once you understand this ruling, you'll realize that situations you once believed required a warrant, judicial approval, or probable cause may now be treated very differently under constitutional law. This case began not with a criminal investigation, but with a welfare check, a situation that many Americans assume is routine, limited, and legally harmless. A concerned individual contacted law enforcement claiming they feared for someone's safety. There was no active crime in progress, no confirmed victim, and no warrant issued by a judge. Instead, officers were responding to a report that suggested a potential emergency might exist behind closed doors. These types of calls happen every day across the country. Police are often asked to check on people who may be experiencing mental health distress, emotional crisis, or personal turmoil. Historically, courts have struggled with how to balance two competing interests in these situations: the government's duty to protect life and the individual's constitutional right to privacy inside their own home. That tension is exactly what brought this case to the Supreme Court. At the heart of this case was a single critical question: when can police enter a private home without a warrant under the Fourth Amendment? The Fourth Amendment is one of the strongest protections Americans have against government intrusion. It states that people have the right to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. For centuries, courts have recognized that a person's home receives the highest level of constitutional protection. As the saying goes, your home is your castle. Generally speaking, law enforcement must obtain a warrant from a judge before entering a home. That warrant must be based on probable cause, supported by evidence, and reviewed by a neutral magistrate. This requirement exists precisely to prevent arbitrary or unjustified government intrusion. But over time, courts have recognized limited exceptions to this rule. One of those exceptions involves emergencies, situations where waiting for a warrant could result in serious injury or loss of life. The challenge has always been defining how much evidence police need before they can cross that threshold without judicial approval. That is the issue the Supreme Court was asked to resolve. Before this case reached the Supreme Court, lower courts across the country were divided. Some courts required a standard close to probable cause before allowing warrantless entry. Others applied a lower threshold, allowing entry based on reasonable suspicion or generalized concern. This lack of uniformity created legal uncertainty for law enforcement and for citizens alike. In the case at hand, the state's highest court upheld the warrantless entry, but it did so using a legal standard that critics argued was too weak. According to that court, officers only needed reasonable suspicion that something might be wrong to justify entering a home. That ruling raised alarm bells for civil liberties advocates. Reasonable suspicion is a relatively low bar. It is the same standard used for brief street stops, not for entering someone's private residence. Applying it to homes could dramatically expand police authority without corresponding judicial oversight. Because of this conflict, the Supreme Court agreed to take the case. When the Supreme Court issues a unanimous decision, it sends a powerful signal. It means that justices appointed by presidents from both political parties, liberal, conservative, and everything in between, reached the same constitutional conclusion. This matters for 3 reasons. First, it makes the ruling far more authoritative. Lower courts are less likely to narrow or reinterpret a unanimous decision. Second, it suggests that the court views the legal question as settled, not debatable. And third, it increases the likelihood that this ruling will be applied broadly and consistently across the country. In other words, this is not a decision that will fade quietly into the background. It is one that judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and police departments will be citing immediately. In its ruling, the Supreme Court held that police officers may enter a home without a warrant when they have an objectively reasonable basis to believe that someone inside is seriously injured or facing an imminent threat of harm. This standard is critical. The court rejected both extremes. On one hand, it rejected the idea that police must have probable cause tied to a criminal investigation before entering in an emergency. On the other hand, it also rejected the notion that vague suspicion or a mere hunch is enough. Instead, the court reaffirmed and clarified a middle standard, objective reasonableness. This means the legality of the entry does not depend on the officer's personal intent or subjective fear. It depends on whether a reasonable officer, knowing what these officers knew at the time, would believe immediate entry was necessary to prevent serious harm. That clarification is now the governing rule nationwide. Because the Supreme Court did not send the case back to the lower courts and instead resolved the constitutional question itself, the ruling is effective immediately. Courts handling similar cases must now apply this standard. This means pending cases involving warrantless home entries will be reevaluated. Evidence that was previously suppressed may now be admitted. Convictions that were overturned could be reinstated. And future police conduct will be judged under this clarified rule. This is why the impact is not hypothetical. It is happening right now. To understand why this ruling carries such sweeping consequences, we need to look closely at how the Supreme Court reached its conclusion. The justices did not simply announce a result, they walked through the reasoning step by step, carefully explaining how the Constitution applies when police are confronted with a potential emergency behind closed doors. This reasoning is what will guide courts, police departments, and attorneys from this point forward. One of the most important aspects of this decision is what the court explicitly rejected. The justices made it clear that probable cause is not required for warrantless home entry in genuine emergency situations. Probable cause is traditionally tied to criminal investigations. It requires a fair probability that evidence of a crime will be found in a specific place. But the court explained that emergency welfare checks do not fit neatly into that framework. When officers are responding to a potential medical crisis, suicide risk, or imminent violence, their goal is not to collect evidence. It is to prevent harm. Requiring probable cause in those moments, the court reasoned, would force officers into an impossible position. They would either have to wait for certainty that someone is injured or dead before acting, or risk violating the Constitution by acting too soon. The Fourth Amendment, the court emphasized, does not demand that officers gamble with human life. This point is critical. By separating emergency aid from criminal investigation standards, the court drew a clear constitutional distinction that will now govern future cases. At the same time, the Supreme Court rejected the lower court's reliance on reasonable suspicion. This is equally important. Reasonable suspicion is a low threshold. It allows officers to briefly detain someone or conduct a limited investigation based on specific, articulable facts suggesting wrongdoing. But the court stressed that entering a home is fundamentally different from stopping someone on the street. A home is entitled to the highest level of Fourth Amendment protection. Allowing warrantless entry based on mere suspicion would dramatically erode that protection. The court was clear. Reasonable suspicion is not enough to justify crossing the threshold of a private residence. By rejecting both extremes, the court positioned objective reasonableness as the constitutional middle ground. So, what does objectively reasonable actually mean? According to the court, it means evaluating the situation from the standpoint of a hypothetical, reasonable officer standing in the same position, with the same information, at the same moment in time. It is not about hindsight. It is not about whether an emergency actually existed, and it is not about what the officers personally believed or intended. This framework gives courts a structured way to analyze emergency entries without turning them into blank checks. The Supreme Court emphasized that its decision was fact-specific. It did not say that any welfare check justifies entry. Instead, it pointed to a combination of factors that, taken together, made the officer's actions reasonable. First, the court focused on the source of the report. The information did not come from an anonymous tipster. It came from someone who personally knew the individual involved and had recently interacted with them. That personal relationship gave the report additional credibility. Second, the court considered the nature of the concern. This was not a vague worry about someone being upset. The report involved potential self-harm and possible violence. When the risk involves serious bodily injury or death, the Constitution allows officers less margin for delay. Third, the court highlighted the officer's contextual knowledge. Some of the responding officers were familiar with the individual and were aware of prior mental health issues and past interactions. That background informed how they assessed the situation. Fourth, the court placed significant weight on the physical observations at the scene. Officers observed indications that a weapon might be present. While lawful gun ownership alone does not justify entry, the presence of a weapon combined with concerns about mental health and potential violence elevated the perceived risk. Finally, the court addressed the individual's complete lack of response. While citizens have every right to ignore police knocking on their door, the court explained that silence can still be a relevant factor in an emergency analysis. In a welfare check context, prolonged non-response may reasonably suggest that someone is incapacitated or unable to seek help. None of these factors alone would necessarily justify entry, but together, the court said, they created an objectively reasonable basis for believing that immediate action was necessary. Another critical clarification in this ruling involves officer intent. The court made clear that subjective motives are irrelevant to the constitutional analysis. It does not matter whether officers were also curious, cautious, or even suspicious. What matters is whether the objective facts justified entry. This protects officers from being second-guessed based on speculation about their mindset, while also limiting entries to situations supported by concrete facts. This principle cuts both ways. It prevents bad faith arguments that officers were really investigating a crime, but it also prevents officers from justifying entry based solely on fear or intuition. Courts will look to the facts, not the feelings. Some observers expected the Supreme Court to issue a narrow ruling and send the case back to the lower courts. Instead, the justices applied the standard themselves and resolved the case outright. That decision signals confidence. It also signals that the court wanted to provide clear guidance, not just for this case, but for thousands of similar situations nationwide. By resolving the constitutional question directly, the court eliminated ambiguity. Law enforcement now knows the rule. Courts now know the test. and citizens now know what standard will be used to judge emergency entries into their homes. Throughout the opinion, the court repeatedly emphasized balance. The Fourth Amendment is not suspended in emergencies, but it is also not blind to reality. The Constitution does not require officers to wait until harm occurs before acting, but it does require restraint, justification, and reason. This decision reflects that balance. It protects life without eliminating privacy. It allows emergency action without authorizing unlimited intrusion. But as we'll see next, the real impact of this ruling will be felt not in Supreme Court opinions, but in everyday interactions between citizens and law enforcement. The question is no longer whether an actual emergency existed, but whether the officer's belief was reasonable at the time. That distinction matters enormously when cases are reviewed months or years later in court. One of the most controversial aspects of this decision is how the court treated silence. The ruling makes clear that while citizens have an absolute right not to answer the door, silence can still factor into an emergency analysis. In a criminal investigation, refusing to answer the door cannot be used as evidence of wrongdoing. But in a welfare check context, prolonged silence, especially when combined with other warning signs, may reasonably suggest that someone is incapacitated or in distress. This does not mean silence alone justifies entry, but it does mean that choosing not to respond no longer automatically insulates a home from emergency entry if other objective factors are present. For gun owners, this ruling raises serious concerns. Firearms are constitutionally protected, but their presence can now play a role in an emergency assessment when combined with other factors like mental health concerns or reports of potential violence. The Supreme Court did not say that owning a firearm justifies entry. It explicitly avoided that conclusion, but it acknowledged that the presence of a weapon can increase the perceived risk in an emergency situation. This creates a gray area. A welfare check involving a reported firearm, emotional distress, and non-response could now lead to warrantless entry, something that gun rights advocates argue opens the door to abuse. Mental health is where this ruling will likely have its greatest impact. Police are often the first responders to mental health crises, even though they are not mental health professionals. This ruling gives officers more constitutional latitude to act quickly when someone may be at risk of self-harm. Supporters argue that this will save lives. Critics argue that it places too much discretion in the hands of law enforcement and risks turning mental health calls into law enforcement encounters that escalate unnecessarily. With nearly 1 in 5 American adults experiencing mental illness in any given year, the scope of this issue is massive. How officers interpret objective reasonableness in these situations will shape countless future encounters. In the courtroom, this decision changes litigation strategy on both sides. Prosecutors will rely on this ruling to argue that emergency entries were justified, even without probable cause. Evidence previously suppressed may now be admitted. Defense attorneys, on the other hand, will focus on attacking the reasonableness of the officer's belief. They will scrutinize the facts known at the time, the reliability of reports, and whether alternative actions were available. Judges will be tasked with walking a tightrope, protecting constitutional rights while acknowledging the realities of emergency response. Critics of the ruling argue that objective reasonableness is still a flexible standard, one that can expand over time. They warn that what is considered reasonable today may become broader tomorrow, especially as courts defer to officer judgment. There is also concern about misuse. False reports, personal grudges, or misunderstandings could potentially trigger welfare checks that escalate into warrantless entries. Once inside, officers may observe evidence unrelated to the original emergency, leading to criminal charges that would never have occurred otherwise. This is the classic slippery slope argument, and it is not without historical precedent. The Supreme Court acknowledged these concerns, but ultimately concluded that the Constitution does not require inaction in the face of credible danger. the justices emphasized that courts remain a backstop. Officers must be able to explain, in detail, why they believed entry was necessary. Vague assertions or generalized fear will not suffice. The ruling does not eliminate judicial review. It shifts it to after the fact, where courts evaluate whether the decision to enter was reasonable under the circumstances. Beyond the immediate issue, this decision sends a broader message about how the court views the Fourth Amendment in modern society. It reflects an understanding that emergencies are unpredictable and that rigid rules can sometimes conflict with public safety. At the same time, the court reaffirmed that the home remains deeply protected. This was not an invitation for routine warrantless entry. It was a clarification of a narrow but powerful exception. This unanimous 9-0 ruling will shape police conduct, court decisions, and constitutional debates for years to come. It strengthens emergency response authority while redefining the boundaries of privacy inside the home. Whether you see this decision as a necessary protection of life or a troubling expansion of government power likely depends on your perspective. But one thing is certain: the legal landscape has changed. Understanding how and why it changed is now essential.